On today's program, ICEJ Canada Executive Director Donna Holbrook visits a religious kibbutz in the Biet She'an Valley. ICEJ President Jürgen Bühler returns to Villa Wannsee in Germany. David Silver has a perspective on the signs of the times.
I'm with Shimon at a kibbutz near Biet She'an. It's great to be here, Shimon, with you. Would you explain the name of the kibbutz and how it was founded?
Okay, we're at kibbutz Sde Eliyyahu. Sde Eliyyahu is named after a rabbi of the 19th century called Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher. He was a precursor of the modern Zionist movement. We're a kibbutz. What makes us special, we're a religious kibbutz. We were founded in 1938 by a group of teenagers who came over from Germany before the Holocaust. Basically, that saved their lives because they left their parents behind. All their parents perished. They came here very, very difficult conditions. It's about 110, 115 in the shade in the summer. And they built up our kibbutz, which has now grown into a large kibbutz of about 680, 700 people. What makes us special, as I'm saying, is that we are Orthodox Jews, which is a real challenge nowadays, having agriculture and living an Orthodox way of life, which means on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, we don't work, we don't use electricity, and we have 400 cows that need to be milked, we have thousands of fish that need to be fed, we have various other things that have to be done, and we found ways using modern technology, meaning everything is done automatically or with air pressure, all sorts of ways of solving the problems. Basically, we're using now laws of Jewish laws that haven't been used for 2,000 years. Nice. That also defines us religious Jews, also defines the way we do our business. And as a kibbutz as well, we're a socialist kibbutz, but we still have to make a living for ourselves, but we try and make a living as an ethical way as possible. And also the way we live, we still live according to the traditional kibbutz model, which means we have a dining room just behind us. That dining room provides meals for our members 3 times a day. Our lives, basically, apart from our own personal homes, are in the communal dining room and in our synagogue, whereas religious Jews, we pray there at least 3 times a day. As a kibbutz, we live a way of equality, which means all of our wages go into a central pool, and each family receives a certain amount according to its family size. We don't own our own houses or our cars. The kibbutz owns everything. And we try, in this big capitalistic world, we try and live as much as we can according to ideas of equality.
So Shimon, we're in your synagogue built in the early 1950s. Tell us about this place.
Okay, number one, it's a very important part of our lives. We're here early every morning, in the summer at 5 o'clock in the morning sometimes, in the afternoon and in the evening, and obviously on Shabbat and the Sabbath. And it was built, an interesting story. In the 1950s, Israel started receiving money from Germany after the Holocaust, and there was a huge argument on the kibbutz what to do, whether it would be okay to accept the money. And as a community that lives according to equality, some people will get, some people won't get. And the members decided a historic decision, which is still in force today, that all the money goes into the central pool of the kibbutz. And from those monies, they built this building, they built the synagogue, they thought it was the right thing to do, in memory as well of their parents and families who perished in the Holocaust. And the roof here is also an interesting story. Before they founded the kibbutz in the 1930s, there was a group here from Germany, of German Christians, called the Templars.
Oh, right.
They built a house on the land here now of Sde Eliyyahu, and it was a very well-built house with very strong bricks and tiles for the roof. The roof here is from the tiles of the original Templar building.
The tiles?
The tiles of the roof, yes.
The tile outside?
Outside, yes.
Oh, I see.
And the building itself was built by members of the kibbutz. It was very important for them to build their own synagogue.
The names around here, they're almost like pillar blocks. They are representative of the families?
No, the names around, it's the last chapter of the verse of the book of Psalms.
All right. Does it start somewhere?
It starts over here.
There? Yes.
Yes. Bless God with a harp and a violin.
And
Bless him with a cymbal, etc., etc., until the land.
Right through.
Until the end of the psalm. That's the idea. That's the idea. But the last verse of the psalm is every breath will bless God at the end.
Oh, that's beautiful. With the menorah up
Yes. And we have the ark in the front.
Mm-hmm.
The ark here was dedicated in memory of a young member of the kibbutz. He was an officer in the IDF who was killed in action. His name was Nadav, which means somebody who volunteers something. And it has on it the verse from the book that talks about volunteering and helping the community.
Okay. And your ark comes from somewhere
It was
special?
built here by a member of the kibbutz.
Right.
And it has on it the decorations on it of pomegranates, which are something we grow here on the kibbutz.
Oh, I see.
And also very Jewish theme. This is our date plantation. It's an organic date plantation. And basically, dates have been grown in Israel since biblical times. And it's a very, very popular fruit. The date palm is special in that there are male and female date palm trees. And what we do is we collect up here the powder from the male trees and we use air pressure to inject it inside the heart of the date palm. And that produces very, very heavy bunches that we're able to produce as many dates as we can. As an organic farm, we don't want to use obviously pesticides or anything also to get rid of the weeds. So we have a very special solution. We have here donkeys. The donkeys, we brought them from a place for donkeys that have been maltreated.
Oh.
And basically they're living here in heaven. They have a constant source of food, the weeds. They do a very good job of eating the weeds. If in the season any dates fall off the tree, they love dates, so they eat the dates immediately. But we also had a problem that, as you can see, our irrigation pipes are tied up in the air because the donkeys discovered that if they bit inside the pipes,
they could get
they
water.
get cold water without having to go up to the water trough.
I see.
So we have to tie them up. They do a very, very good job. They're self-sufficient and helps us to control the weeds without using any sort of chemicals or anything else.
That's beautiful. That's great. Shimon, you've brought us a beehive.
So this is a hive of bumblebees, not honeybees. Usually a hive of honeybees will have thousands of bees inside. This has only a few hundred bees. They do not produce honey, and they use any sort of pollen which is in their area. So we use these to pollinate tomato plants, strawberry plants, peppers, etc., etc. In the last decade or so, Israel has developed the cherry tomato.
Yes.
So in a greenhouse, you don't just have one big tomato, you have a bunch of instead about 10 small tomatoes, and it's impossible to pollinate by hand. Now what is good about the bumblebee is that it is very, very sensitive to pesticides. And if a farmer will use a pesticide, he can't use bumblebees, and all farmers now use bumblebees. These are miniature wasps. What they do is they lay their eggs in the pest, and it's a bit like the film Alien. They lay their eggs, and it develops until it bursts out the pest, and then it basically kills the pest.
Up next, ICEJ President Jürgen Bühler returns to Villa Wannsee in Germany.
One of the reasons why the German history developed like it did in the 30s and the 40s was also a change in the formation of anti-Semitism and the expression of anti-Semitism. What started as a Christian expression, a theological expression of Jew hatred, where people hated the Jewish people because they were called Christ killer, Adolf Hitler brought a complete new form of anti-Semitism to the field, which had a pseudo-scientific expression. It was called the racial theory that was even taught in university. The basis of this expression came from Darwin's evolution theory, and the form and the expression of this theory was called social Darwinism, where Darwin's evolution theory have been applied to human beings and the way how human races are behaving between each other. What was obvious for Hitler that he said, we Aryans, we Germans, we are the master race, we are called to govern everything. And at the same time, he singled out the Jewish people as the weak link in the racial family of the world. And he said, these weak links, they are like parasites that needs to be exterminated from our earth. And that's why this conference was taking place, the Wannsee conference. It was the target to kill every Jew that was living in Europe. We are here at Villa Wannsee, just outside of Berlin, one of the main Holocaust memorial sites here in the city of Berlin. And I'm here with Mr. Biet She'an. He's the Director for Public Relations and Communications here at the Center for the Wannsee Conference. Mr. Biet, it's great to have you with us here today.
Thank you.
The question then is, if Hitler and the leading Nazi people have been such a secular bunch of people, why did Hitler sense that the Jews needs to be exterminated here in Europe?
Jews are being perceived as a dangerous worldwide conspiracy. That is to say, they are not only ugly, they are not only posing a threat and a danger in that very town or in that region or in a certain continent, but that the Jews are perceived to be an eternal and worldwide opponent that has the ability to conspire to kill the Aryans. The Aryans was an imagined race in Hitler's thought were in a eternal and final struggle with a Jewish opponent. In My Struggle, is that the English translation of Hitler's book? There is a sentence where he anticipates the winning Jews, and that after the Jews had won, Earth would die down because a parasite cannot live without its host. Yeah. That is a very radical thinking, but it was meant seriously. The entry of war of the United States in December 1941, in Hitler's perception, was the moment in time that meant and clearly showed in that perception that there was a final struggle. In December 1941 was the moment that the Wannsee Conference was invited. Thus, the Wannsee Conference takes place in a situation where the leader of the German Reich thought that this final struggle against the Jew had reached its peak, and that now the physical destruction must be the necessary consequence. Being here at the Wannsee Conference building and seeing the catastrophic outcome of social Darwinism and the pseudo-scientific theory that emerged from it, I am reminded in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, where God says that God created man in the image of God. The Bible teaches us to be against racism, against any other people group, and we as Christians, we should be taking a lead in those values to show the world what it means to love your neighbor.
Up next, David Silver has a perspective on the signs of the times.
We've been talking about kind of the trajectory of the Middle East and, the issue of Iran and Israel and God's plans and the craziness that's about to explode. Let's talk a little bit maybe what the scripture is pointing towards these times. You've said it, we're living in the end times. Let's talk a little bit about that, Brother David.
Okay, well, you know, I got born again about 31 years ago, and way back then I got connected with a ministry, an end-time evangelist who spoke about the end times. So that's been my focus for a long time. Then I kind of got away from it, got more into the Israel thing, but over the last few years, God's brought it back into my focus, because really the truth is you can't separate Israel from the end times.
Right.
And, you know, I know that down through the ages, good Bible-believing Christians all expected the Lord to come in their lifetime.
In their time, yeah.
And of course, I think Paul told us we need to be ready. But obviously, he hasn't come yet. And I truly believe I've mentioned it once or twice in these interviews, that we are living in the end times. And, you know, Yeshua, I think it's in Luke, or Matthew or Luke, one of the few times he rebukes the people around him. He said, look, you guys, you know the weather tomorrow by the signs in the sky, but you don't know the signs of the times in which you live. And, you know, conversely to that, the Bible commends the sons of Issachar, because they understood the times in which they live. And if we truly are living in the end times, then we need to be aware of that, and we need to be ready for ourselves and for our family and our friends and for whatever else God has called me to do. So I have a message that I preach. I don't call it the signs of the times. I call it the times of the signs, because I believe there are some very clear biblical-based signs that we are truly living in the end times. And the prophets, you know, the prophets said at the end of the age, or in the last days, those are words of, they're time indicators. So one of the things that the prophet said would happen at the end of the age, or in the end times, that God would bring the Jewish people back to the land.
Right.
And as we've already said in a previous interview, there are now 8 million Jews living in Israel. Most of them have come back from every corner of the earth over the last 100 years.
More inside than outside of Israel.
And actually we passed a threshold that there are more knowing Jews living in the land than outside of the land. That was just a year or so ago. So that's a real
big historic moment, yeah.
They're still coming home at 1,000 a week, but it's increasing because of the increase in persecution and anti-Semitism.
Right.
And, you know, this might sound like a strange thing for a Jewish person to say, but we don't pray against anti-Semitism because it's what God uses to bring the Jewish people home, and God needs all the Jewish people home for the end times to be fulfilled, and for the words of the prophets to be fulfilled, to release Yeshua to come back.
Right.
So we don't pray against the anti-Semitism, because we saw God use it back in the 90s again when communism came down. When communism came down, the ruble fell, and at that time there were millions of Jews living in the former Soviet Union. The ruble came down. As the ruble went down, the anti-Semitism went up, and they blamed the Jewish people.
Oh, wow.
But as that anti-Semitism and persecution went up, it was proportionate to the number of Jewish people getting out and coming to Israel. And, you know, generally speaking, most people don't get up en masse and leave a country if life is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but God clearly from the scriptures, He wants all of the Jewish people back in the land. So the fact that they're still coming home at 1,000 a week, it's on the increase. So again, if your viewers, if anybody's praying against anti-Semitism, please don't pray that. You can pray, God, please don't let anybody be hurt or injured.
Yeah.
But you know, God says in one of the passages in Zephaniah, I'm gonna whistle for my people. So what you can pray is that God would whistle louder, that the Jewish people will hear that whistle and begin to move from Canada and Europe and wherever it may be. And actually, it was the Iron Curtain that held them in the east. What holds them back in the west, my wife calls it the golden.
The golden curtain. Wow.
And see, this is one of the reasons I believe why the money system's going to crash and things are going to get tougher, because God's He's going to do whatever He needs to do to shake the Jewish people out of the nations where they are. So that's number one sign that they are coming home. Paul says in Romans 11:26-27, one day, as it is written, all Israel will be saved.
Yeah.
And there are 300 congregations and growing in Israel and around the nations.
Yeah, that's another sign.
Yep,
Absolutely.
and I believe the third sign, and the last thing really that I believe God is doing, is I believe that God created Israel to be an apostolic nation. You know, even at Mount Sinai, we were called to be a light to the nations.
Right.
And you know, before the days of the internet, the only way you could influence the nations was to go to the nations. And
Right.
you know, even the last words that Yeshua spoke on earth in Matthew 28:19, and he was speaking to the Jewish apostles and disciples. You know, the church calls it the Great Commission,
yeah.
but it was given to Israel, and he said, "Go into the nations." So that was just a reconfirmation from the very mouth of Yeshua of that apostolic calling on the nations. And now I know that in the church, the word apostle, it's a big deal. But you know, in Israel, it's not such a big deal because the word apostle is the Hebrew word shaliach, which comes from the word lishloach, to send out. You know, into Israel today, we call the parcel delivery guy, the postman, he is called a shaliach.
He's an apostle?
He's an apostle.
Wow, isn't that interesting?
Because he's sent out by the post office to bring your mail. So it's not such a big deal. We are it just simply means someone who has sent us out, and God has called us to be a light to the nation. So those of us who have this calling in our, you know, it's in my bones actually.
Yeah, well, you're
I'm out of the country. At
You're
least
one of those ones,
I'm one of the 40 or 50 of us that are currently traveling the nations. But you know, the final fulfillment of all of that is all of the Jews have to be back in the land. All Israel needs to be saved, and there needs to be 144,000 Messianic Jewish apostolic evangelists. We don't have to label ourselves with. We just have to go and do what God's called us to do, and then it says, "And then the end shall come." So I believe those are the signs that we truly are living in the end times. And of course, there are lots of other end time ministries, but you know. I remember I was going to England to do a speaking tour once, and one of the pastors who invited me, he sent me an email. He said, "David, will you come to my church? Please don't speak about the end times." He said, because we've heard so much wrong teaching, our people are tired of it. And I wrote back and I said, "Pastor, you know, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of wrong teaching out there, but the reason is Israel is the apple of God's eye. Israel is God's time clock. And all of these other, or most of these other ministries don't put Israel in the center of their end time, you know, eschatology it's called. And if you don't put Israel into the very center of your end time eschatology to unlock the mystery, you can't possibly get it right.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that if you really want to know where we are in prophetic time, even study the feasts, because the biblical feasts lay out God's prophetic time clock.
True.
But watch Israel.
Right.
You know, if Israel's the apple of God's eye, Israel needs to be the apple of all of our eye. We need to watch it. And you know, again, just to finish off on a call to prayer, it's underway.
Yes.
The Jews are coming home. We're coming to faith, and we're coming back to the nations. And if the believers in Canada and around the world want to fulfill that calling to stand with Israel and to bless Israel and to hasten the day of the Lord's return, simply pray the scriptures.
Amen.
Pray that God will continue to bring the Jewish people home. Pray He'll continue to bring us into faith, and that He will raise up the other 143,950 Messianic evangelists, and then the end will come.
Well, we're seeing it unfold before our very eyes. Let's continue to pray. You know, Canadian Church, if you want to see many of these prophetic things fulfilled, you know, right before your eyes, if the Lord opens the door, come with the ICEJ to Israel. Come visit Brother David on Mount Carmel.
Yeah, please do.
You know, you'll never go wrong if you can make it to Israel one day to actually see it unfold before your very eyes.
And your life will never be the same again.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Bible comes to life. Bible comes to life. Wonderful, Brother David. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Donna Holbrook, National Executive Director of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, Canada. Audrey Ruth Peer was one of our members who came to know about the work of the ICEJ in bringing comfort here, and she passed away as an only child and with no children of her own. She had two regrets in her life. One was that she didn't have children, and the other one that she never came to the land of Israel. So when she passed away, she left an estate. I shared it with her friend Pat, who knew her for over 60 years. I said, "Pat, what do you think Audrey would like, how we use her funds?" So music was important to her, children also important to her. And so we undertook the fund and we divided it 4 ways equally. And it went to a petting zoo for children, for orphan boys near Tel Aviv. It also went to build 2 new music rooms at Bet Yosef up at Haifa, which is a very large community center. We also helped to complete a playground for another orphanage to the south of Israel. And then it enabled us to restore our scholarship for Christian young adults. And even though she was never in Israel, her name is in the land on those 3 projects, and it continued for 5 years on our Canadian scholarship for Christian leaders who have never been to Israel, who are in the age group of 17 to 30. Would you consider being a shomer, keeper of Israel, in your state giving? And that leaves a wonderful legacy here in Israel.
Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to visit our website at www.icejcanada.tv or call us at 1-866-324-9133. And for our Canadian residents, be sure to ask for your free Canada contributions to ICEJ Canada. Through your contributions, you can participate by giving to Haifa Home for Holocaust Survivors, Haifa Women at Risk, Red Carpet Project, Women at Risk, Operation Life Shield Project, Bomb Proof Operation Life Shield, Mentoring Program, Aliyah Support, Mentoring Program, Children's Project, Israel in Crisis, Israel in Crisis, Israel David Adam, Emergency Services, Emergency Christian Friends of Yad Vashem, Scholarships for Young Adult Leaders, Young Adult ICEJ Canada Media Fund, Canada Media Fund, Estate Gift Security Fund, Securities Fund.